Welcome, one and all, to Sociology Princess, where we explore sociology through Disney. My name's Christy, and my goal today is to center a very overlooked topic when it comes to Disney and even film in general: disability. Disney has included a plethora of disabled characters in its magical worlds. For the sake of time, I won't go into every one of these characters, but I did want to quickly state each and every character with a disability in the Disney and Pixar universe. So, to the best of my knowledge, as of the year 2024, here is a complete list: Dopey, Gus, Dumbo, Captain Hook, Quasimodo, Nemo, Vanellope, Elsa, almost every single fish in Finding Dory, Renee from Loop, and the adorable boy from Float. And some people have even made the case that Ariel is disabled, and I find that a really interesting topic. I won't get much into it here, but if Ariel is a disabled Disney princess to you, I'm good with that. So, this podcast is a first in a three-part series on disability in Disney and Pixar animation. So, this podcast is the first in a three-part series on disability in Disney and Pixar animation. Today's podcast will be focused on four of Disney's non-speaking characters: Dopey, Gus, Dumbo, and Gerald from Finding Dory. There are some things I find problematic about the representation that have been overlooked by many viewers. The second part of the series is a deep dive into Finding Dory and how the aquarium can be a metaphor for an institution. Finally, I wanted to wrap up this series by talking about how recent but significant strides have been made by Disney and Pixar towards authentic representation of speaking and non-speaking disabled characters, so we get to end on a positive note. Just a heads up about today's episode: I will be discussing ableism that is present in these films, notably the mistreatment of these characters with disabilities. If that is not something you are in the headspace for, I understand, and I hope you'll jump ahead to episode 6, which will talk more about the positive examples of disability representation. For everyone else, I'm glad that you are able to join me as we begin our journey into Disney's history of disabled characters. Disney has a trend of having non-speaking characters be unnecessary to the plot at best and disposable at worst. The very first example of this is Dopey and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I know that everyone's all up in arms about the new remake, but honestly, this whole feminism conversation, this is not my problem with the film Snow White. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not very concerned about that because feminism in film is fortunately something that's actually getting the representation it deserves, and yet for some reason we keep overlooking other areas of diversity in film. And if Disney keeps Dopey the same, that's gonna be my issue with the Snow White film. They can't keep this character the same, and let me explain why. The book Diversity in Disney Films: Critical Essays on Race, Ethnicity, Gender, Sexuality, and Disability serves as a guidepost for any sociology nerds like me who want to really dissect the hidden messages Disney's movies put out. One essay specifically covers 3 characters that the authors state are coded as having intellectual disabilities. Swartz, Marie Latvia, and Hansen wrote the aptly named piece, Dopey's Legacy: Stereotypical Portrayals of Intellectual Disability in Classic Animated Films, beginning with Dopey, the inaugural disabled Disney character. The first thing to know about Dopey that I learned from the essay was that the animators originally modeled him after a dog, like an actual pet dog. This already puts the character in a position where they can be considered less than human. They also note that Dopey's physical characteristics are supposed to indicate a childlike innocence, as he's the only dwarf without a beard and has unsuspecting blue eyes. He is also the bearer of most of the physical quote unquote comedy for this film. All the other dwarfs are honestly tsunderes around him. Genuinely, tsunderes. A tsundere is a term from the anime community where there's a character that likes another character, so they beat him up. And in some ways, that's kind of what the other dwarves do to him. The authors state he is the punching bag for the other dwarves, as he is repeatedly stepped on when others climb over him. One of the most frustrating things about this film that was pointed out by the writers is that Dopey is treated as dispensable by the other dwarves. They're not concerned when he lags behind as they return from work, and when there's a strange noise in their house, all the other dwarves elect Dopey to be the one to go upstairs and check it out. But you might be saying, that's just the 1937 film. Hasn't the character had some evolution since then? This story's been redone time and time again. Well, turns out I was watching Isaac Carlson's YouTube channel even back when it was lots of videos, and he actually talks about Dopey in the Snow White stage play. Unlike the movie, Dopey actually has a single word in the play. One word. Mama. He calls Snow White his mom. And this is somehow worse to me than him not talking at all. I feel like this theater production sends this subtle message that if someone is caring enough, patient enough, warm enough, then the person they are taking care of will eventually be able to communicate through speech. This is not always true in real life. And I'm excited to go into detail about alternative methods of communication later on. But for now, just know there's no one right way to communicate, and to be kind and warm to everyone, regardless of whether they use mouth words or not. I will now transition to our next non-speaking character that the essay references, which is Gus, or Gus Gus, from Cinderella. Similar to his counterpart Dopey, Gus is often scolded verbally and physically by Jacques, who is his friend? Maybe? He doesn't really act like a friend. The authors describe how Gus is shown to be different from the other mice as he physically features a rotund belly, his speech is hard to understand, unintelligible, and he's often placed on the outskirts of the mice's social groups. The writers continue to explain how Gus is othered by describing how he ends up in situations where the audience considers him incompetent. He struggles to get food, what some consider to be a very basic task, until Cinderella comes to his aid. He also doesn't find great success when him and Jack are sent out on a mission to retrieve beads for Cinderella's necklace from underneath the paws of the devious Lucifer. And while Gus does speak, he has failed to be understood on several occasions, which to me clearly puts him in the category of someone who communicates differently. Before we move on from the classic Disney characters to a more modern misstep, I want to touch on two other Disney classic characters really quick. I'll briefly discuss Dumbo and then give some thoughts on Quasimodo. So, while Dumbo, again, does not communicate verbally, his story is very different from the previous two, as it is a supercrip narrative. The term supercrip was coined by Eli Clare, and part of its definition is that disabled people are only viewed as valuable when accomplishing superhuman tasks like climbing an impossible mountain. If you still catch cable TV every once in a while, there's an ad where a blind guy climbs Mount Everest, and that may come to mind when you hear the definition of supercrip. I hope they gave this guy lots of sweet, sweet compensation for this commercial. Hopefully, by hearing the definition, you may be starting to recognize how Dumbo fits into the supercrip narrative. Dumbo's disability of big ears can double as a superpower. There's only two sides to a supercrip story: completely cast out and inept, or superhuman and better than the rest. There's no disability on the same platform as anyone else. It's always either less than or better than. And that's not really a helpful way to view disability in our society. This movie shows the shift of how the other characters go from treating Dumbo like a burden to treating him like a superstar. Thus, I do not find the story of Dumbo to be encouraging for people with disabilities personally, since disability usually does not come with some sort of magical power that allows us to do what others can't. Though, of course, we all love a good savant story. And savants do absolutely have a place in the disability community, but we can't let these supernatural abilities be the only disability narratives we hear. And besides, we all know that amazing powers come from your midi-chlorian count, right? Right? So the next classic character featured in the essay is Quasimodo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, or as I will refer to it as, the bell ringer of Notre Dame. If you are curious, the proper medical term for what Quasimodo has is kyphosis. My main problem with this story actually comes from something that a former YouTuber pointed out named Lindsay Ellis. While I wish her all the best on Nebula, I did want to revisit a snippet of her analysis on this film. She personally thinks it's fine that Quasimodo does not end up with Esmeralda. She acknowledges that it would be a great thing for a character with disabilities to be able to be in relationships with able bodied counterparts, but it's Quasimodo's character of not possessing Esmeralda that sets him apart from the villain of the film, Frollo. He wants Esmeralda to make her own decisions, Frollo does not. And normally I'd be more okay if Quasimodo didn't get the girl, if we actually had more interabled relationships in media. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and I still kind of wish Quasimodo ended up with Esmeralda, but I don't see that part of the story changing anytime soon, at least not by Disney. It'd have to be a completely new retelling. I think The Bell Ringer of Notre Dame actually ties into something I found interesting, which is the matching hypothesis from psychology. The general idea is that people will seek out potential relationships with those who they find to be of a similar level of attractiveness as themselves. This is not to say that people are trying to purposefully exclude those they don't find attractive. It's typically done so the person would feel secure in the relationship, aka the person's at quote unquote their level. There can also be a halo effect, where if we find someone attractive, then we are more likely to associate positive qualities with them, such as kindness or generosity. While I understand the matching hypothesis conceptually, I hope that people can continue to redefine what is beautiful and include disabled bodies and disabled minds in that definition. Also, as Lindsay points out, Quasimodo does get a stereotypically attractive woman in the direct VHS sequel, but let's face it, the film's not as good, which is why it went directly to VHS, and I feel sad that we didn't get to see an interabled relationship on the big screen. All right, now that we've covered the classics, I want to jump to the solely 3D animation studio Pixar and their film Finding Dory. And I do have a lot of positive things to say about Finding Dory, but I saved that all for the next episode. Daily Beast writer Elizabeth Picciuto goes in depth about Gerald's appearance, stating that the animators gave him cynophorus, a unibrow, an overbite, and somewhat misaligned eyes. I agree with the writer that these physical features contribute to showcasing Gerald as having an intellectual disability. While in real life, someone may or may not have physical features that would allow onlookers to notice their disability status, we see a trend at this point of Disney characters with intellectual disabilities being animated differently from the other characters in their cohort. The writer also states that the child's pale indicates the childlike innocence of Gerald, similar to how Dopey's features are meant to make him appear more youthful. Gerald is clearly bullied in the film by the other sea lions who refuse to share their rock. The sharing is caring attitude that parents try to instill in their kids is noticeably absent from these interactions. Also, this interaction is primarily done for laughs from the audience, which, in my opinion, absolutely harkens back to Dopey and Gus. I would say this scene in Finding Dory loosely implies that it's okay to act selfishly and exclude those who are different from you, and that's not my favorite message to come out of a family-friendly film. But wait, there is still somewhat of an upside to Gerald. Yeah, I know, I have a hard time believing it too, but hear me out. Disability activist Alice Wong believes the after credit scene helps provide more nuance to Gerald's character. Eventually, Gerald does sneak onto the rock and finds himself where he belongs, and Wong admires his persistence, seeing this as a sort of victory where Gerald is able to pull one over on his bullies. Surprisingly to me, Gerald was not supposed to be interpreted as disabled at all. Jacob Shameson, for Insider, does detail how the animators actually had conversations about trying to portray Gerald as not intellectually disabled, but rather as a nerd. They mentioned that Gerald originally had the child's pail on his head, but some people on the team were concerned that it would make Gerald seem a little too similar to having an intellectual disability. While I do believe the animator's intent is good, and I appreciate that they had these conversations, I don't think this came across in the end product. I think a huge reason for this is because Gerald does not speak in the movie. As far as the audience knows, Gerald is non-speaking. I think the presence or absence of speech is a huge indicator of whether a character is perceived as having a disability or not. Because Gerald does not talk and the other sea lions do, and even most of the other fish in the film, it's very easy for the audience to read Gerald as the other. I honestly have thought long and hard about this, maybe way more than I should have. But the conclusion I came to is I think the animators should have made Gerald talk. If they really wanted to commit to the nerd bit, and I love a good nerd bit, they could have given Gerald a nasally voice. This would have conveyed their message clearer than by having Gerald not speak at all. Anytime there's a character who doesn't speak, viewers are likely to think of this character as either a character who's disabled or a character that's experienced trauma. In this case, the first assumption was made, which sparked the discussion surrounding Gerald and his role in a piece that otherwise amicably portrays its disabled cast. Ultimately, I do wish Gerald's narrative was more clear and was not as reminiscent of his predecessors, Dopey and Gus. But the good news is, this is just the beginning of my analysis of disability in the Disney universe. And I have a lot of positive things to say about Finding Dory and other Pixar works coming up. Thank you so much for sticking around for my analysis of disabled Disney characters, and I hope you found these tidbits informative when viewing some classic Disney works. Also, if you are interested in dipping into scholarly thoughts on these and other Disney films, then check out the book Diversity in Disney Films. This riveting read is broken down into sections about how gender, sexuality, race, and disability are portrayed in Disney films. The scholarship is insightful but easy to read. If you are a Disney fan and you have an interest in the social sciences or the hidden messages in Disney's catalog, I highly recommend this book. Lastly, I would also like to recommend a YouTube video by Sewstein, Sewstine, who invited other content creators to talk about racism in Disney movies. I could never say it as elegantly as they could, but they gave so much good information in this video, particularly on Dumbo and Princess and the Frog. So please go check it out and support these creators. Once again, thanks for joining me on this journey. I'm excited to record episode 5, where I will talk about all the positives and metaphors in Finding Dory. Episode 6, where I talk about Elsa and why she's a disabled queen. And episode 7, where I will be talking about my 2 favorite Pixar shorts. So, once again, thanks for listening. And remember, shade never made anybody less autistic.